conference already?
Yes.
It's been super. This is the first time I've ever been to a SHRM conference, and I'm pretty sure it will not be my last. If they'll let me come back, I don't know. Maybe I'll go on a list someplace where they won't let me come back in. I don't know. Listen, I want to thank you for coming. There are many places you could be right now, many things you could be doing with your time, and I'm really humbled and very honored that you would spend this time here with me. I also want to thank BIW for their collaboration. They've made a lot of the research dissemination that I do possible. So when we talk about things like compassionate leaders, or we talk about stinky leaders, and I'll explain those concepts in a minute, they've been instrumental in helping share that. And then, of course, I work at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky. Has anybody been to Louisville, Kentucky? You all have to come now, right? And you're coming to dinner at my house, and I'm going to clean my house. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing. I do teach at the University of Louisville. I've been teaching there for going on 7 years now, but I've been studying the idea of employee engagement and the employee value proposition for the last 15. I did all of my doctoral work at Florida International University on the idea of engagement. And we've spent an enormous amount of time trying to understand why is it that people give more of themselves at work, or why is it that they push back? One of the things that we've uncovered is the role of leadership is absolutely critical. And I read some stuff a couple of years ago that suggested that, managers don't really matter. Leaders don't really matter. They're so removed from the process that they don't really make a difference in an employee's day. And I want you to know that we've conducted 25 different studies, and every single one of those studies highlights the importance of a manager and a leader in an employee's life cycle. And it directly impacts things like effort, turnover, discretionary effort, well-being, all things that we're going to unpack a little bit more today. So here's what I'd like to do. As much as we can, I would love to just have a discussion with you. So I'm going to share some information with you. But I wonder what your reaction might be. How does this relate to where you work? What's your experience with some of this stuff? What problems keep you up at night? And how can we together, not just me, but how can we together have a discussion that would help us all get a little bit better as a result of spending an hour here together today? So I want to start by just overviewing some of the things that I talked about in the keynote. Remember those 3 ideas of a strong EVP, and I really believe in this. And you heard me say this in the keynote session, that I believe that people who work in an organization who have good leaders, who feel like their voice matters, who do meaningful work, who believe they contribute, they live life differently. I mean, life is fundamentally different for those people, and our research shows that. There's a line, there's a critical tipping point for someone who's at work of how they live their life more abundantly. When they go home, they have more energy for their family, they have more energy for their community, they have more energy for their work, or where that begins to detract from that, right? And they begin to pull back, and they're not healthy. They don't have as much energy to give, and we start thinking about things like intention to turnover, right? These 3 things are really important. The distinction that I tried to make in the keynote was that oftentimes leaders start with a practice-based focus, all right? So we might think of the strategies. So what are the 5 things that I can do today that would impact this? And I think that's one way to think about it. But when practice drives principle, okay? So when we put the practices before the principle, we can objectify that process. And remember, when we objectify the process, we remove the human element. And as soon as we do that, we remove the employee from employee engagement. Or we remove the employee from employee value proposition, right? Which is what we don't want to do. The idea of engagement and the employee value proposition is that the employee is the individual at the center of the conversation. So what is it like on their very first day of work? And how do we use things like the cumulative principle, theory of reciprocity, this idea of engagement? How do we use those to our advantage to leverage practices that are unique to your organizations? I get asked the question a lot, well, what can I do to engage my employees at my company? To be honest with you, I don't know, because I don't work at your company. I can tell you what you can do at the University of Louisville because I know that context, right? But if I was to say to you, well, if you just do these 5 things, right? I don't know anything about where you work. I don't know the kind of talent that you attract. I don't know the industry that you're in. I'm not sure the challenges or the problems that you're facing. So I think the more appropriate answer would be, well, how do we use these principles to then leverage practices that are contextually sensitive to where you work? And I think that's the better approach to the idea of an employee value proposition or this idea of engagement. And then I had shared this research on leader behaviors. This was a 2-year, it was a multi-phase study where we interviewed 31 different leaders from around our city. So the mayor in our city came to my research team and said, we have this idea of compassion. And we need to find an ROI for compassion. Can you help us identify what's the ROI for this? So we interviewed 31 different leaders for an hour apiece, so people just like yourself. And we would come and we would say, tell us about how you work. What is it that you do? Tell me about your day. What are the things that you do? How do you engage with your employees? What are the practices that you do? And we wrote all those things down, right? We recorded all those things down. And then we looked back through all 31 and we thematically coded them. We came up with the 6 top themes: dignity, authenticity, presence, accountability, empathy, and integrity, right? And as I mentioned in the keynote, guys, these are not hard. These are easy to do. It's easy to treat people with dignity. But how many times have you seen people at work or in our organizations, or you've had even personal experiences where you've been asked to do work that's undignified, or you've been treated without dignity? Right, and you've been objectified. That employee has been removed from the idea of value prop or the idea of engagement. And we can go on down that line, right? So once we came up with these 6 themes, and I'm going to show you this research a little bit later, we then sent out a survey to a large financial conglomerate in the Midwestern United States. We had thousands of people that wrote us back, that took our survey. And I'm going to show you that data. I'm going to save that for a little bit later. But I want you to know that this isn't something that we just came up with. This is grounded in extremely solid research that was presented at the Academy of Management just last year. What I think is striking about this for me is what's below the line. So the ideas of humiliation and insincerity and distractedness and what that does for the reciprocity principle at play in organizations, right? So if I'm leading from a place of insincerity, and that's the seed that I sow, right? And I sow seeds of humiliation and insincerity and avoidance and being detached, I should expect to reap that crop, right? And the interesting thing about planting seeds like that is you always reap more than you sow. And so if those are the seeds that I'm planting, I should expect to get that back in twofold. And I have heard, as I mentioned earlier, I've heard leaders stand up and say, I leave with humiliation. And I'm sad. I'm sad for those employees because I've seen the effects of what that looks like later on down the line, and it's sad. So what I want to do to frame up our conversation today is to share a tale of 2 clients. I want to give you 2 case studies, okay? So I want to kind of unpack the research that I talked about in the keynote session today and give you the data to give some context around the conversation that we might have this afternoon. So the first is, how do we understand the role of dysfunction? And this research came about, I had some colleagues of mine, we were standing around, literally, we were at a water cooler, right? Which is pretty cliche. So we're standing at a water cooler and we're telling war stories about really bad bosses that we've had, like just really terrible human beings, but that were our leaders. And we thought, do these individuals impact our long-term decision-making processes? So when I think about that person, does that person impact the way I make decisions? Have they impacted my confidence in ways that are long-term? Have they impacted my health in ways that are long-term? And is there a way for us to look at that and study that? Our hypothesis was that people who work for dysfunctional leaders, that those leaders stick with them over time. We call those leaders stinky leaders. So the picture of the animal in the bottom right-hand corner is of a skunk. And skunk is a really common animal in the U.S. If you've never smelled a skunk, it is offensive, right? I mean, the odor is just absolutely offensive. Last week, I have a dog at home, and our dog got skunked by our house, and my wife and I were sitting in the house, and we were like, oh, what is that smell? And then we could see outside the dog had gotten skunked, and it smelled really bad, and then we spent the next 2 hours washing the skunk off of our dog. And to this day, she still smells like the skunk. So the idea is this, that dysfunctional leaders professionally skunk their employees, such that the effects of that person will stay with them for a long period of time. That there's healing that has to be done. In the same way that I have to wash that stink off my dog and off of me, is the same way that you have to heal, or I have to heal, from working with dysfunctional leaders. We estimate in the U.S., and I've not done this work in India, so if there's anybody that's interested in doing some partnership research, you let me know. We estimate in the U.S. that between 28 and 36% of employees work for a leader that we would categorize as dysfunctional. Now, we draw a distinction between abusive and dysfunctional. Abusive leaders, right? The first time somebody throws something at you or flips a table, which both of those things I've seen in person, right? We know that person. We're like, oh, hey, she's a table flipper. Watch out for her, right? She's gonna throw something at us. I know to stay out of her way, right? But the dysfunctional leader erodes slowly the emotional energy of the employee over time. And they operate under the radar, often using policy and procedure as their whipping stone. So they will bring you into a performance review, right? It's just you and them. Just you and them. And then they'll use that opportunity to talk down to you, to erode your confidence, and so on down the line, right? So we're not talking about abusive leaders. Those are different, and that's a totally different animal. But I would suggest to you that it's the dysfunctional leader that is perhaps the most problematic between the two, because we often don't know who they are. The research that we looked at, so we came up with this percentage of around 36%, which we think is pretty low. Actually, we think it's a little bit higher than this. And we wondered, all right, well, what are the actual leader behaviors, right? What are those leader behaviors? So we read everything we could on the idea of dysfunction. We read everything we could on the idea of abuse in the workplace. And we categorized all of those words. So we wrote down every word that someone said. They use foul language, they use intimidation, they bribe, all the way to things like they pressure me to do certain things at work, right? We wrote all those things down, and then we put that in a survey. We sent that out to people, and we asked them a series of questions. We said, how often does this happen to you at work, right? So what's the frequency? And how traumatic is this to you personally and at work? So is this just an annoyance, right? It just gets in the way? Or is this something that is really affecting you and your work? And here's what we found. So ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in India, what we call the Stinky Taxonomy. Now I've blown this up a little bit. So the axis that you're looking at are, at the top of that is high frequency, at the bottom of it that's low frequency. On the far left-hand side is the word annoyance. And I know it's cut off the screen, but I did that on purpose so that you could see some of the other words. And then on the far right-hand side is traumatic. Notice the things in the top right-hand quadrant. Things that happen the most frequent and the things that are the most traumatic. At the very top, ignores my opinion. That is not a terribly egregious behavior. We would not categorize that as traumatic, I don't think. Have you ever had your opinion repeatedly ignored in meetings? Have you ever had, sometimes I have my opinion repeatedly ignored at home, right? Like, no one cares where I want to go to dinner or what movie I want to see, right? And at night, I do not get the channel changer, right? My daughter gets that. But at the very top of that list is ignores my opinion. Underneath that, takes ownership of ideas, withholds information, breaks promises. These are not crazy things. Remember I said it's the things that are easy to do and the things that are easy not to do. It's easy to not ignore someone's opinion. It's easy to not to give credit for ideas. You come up with an idea, you should get credit for it. It's easy for me to give you credit for that idea, or to give you credit for that idea. Or when I say I'm going to do something to follow, it's easy to follow through on my promises. But you know what? Sometimes it's easy not to do that too. It's a little slip. I'm just going to take credit for the idea, right? All the way down to things like lies to me starts rumors is vindictive. Can you see how this would slowly over time erode the emotional and psychological safety of an organization? These leaders are very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. And I shared this earlier in a different format, but these are the outcomes of that. So this is what people told us. So they said, not only are these things happening in my organization, and they're annoying and traumatic, and they happen a lot, but here's the outcome for me. That when I go home at night, I can't sleep. I can't go to bed. I lay in bed awake, and I have to take sleeping pills. They have trouble with physical functioning, manifested pain. And I laugh about that because I can't imagine work being so bad that my body physically hurts from that experience, right? And I had a lady, I was given a seminar in the Midwest, and then there was a lady that was out at a table, and she was crying. She came up to me afterwards, and she was like, that's who I work for. Like, I work for that guy. What do you think I ought to do? I said, you need to get out of there. You got to go, right? Like, the safest, the healthiest thing you can do right now is to walk away from that place and go find something else, right? So this is the sad part of leadership. And I hope you can understand why dysfunctional leaders and leader behavior, so when we operate from that humiliation, insincerity, avoidance, distractedness, when those are the behaviors that we're operating from, these are the outcomes of that. I would imagine in a place like this, the value proposition is quite negative, right? There isn't much of a value proposition. I think the good news is, on the flip side, it's really transformational. It's really quite positive. So this is that research that I mentioned to you earlier, where the mayor came to our research team and said, we're trying to find this ROI for compassion, and we particularly want to look at compassionate leaders. Can you help us identify what are the competencies and what is the ROI for that? So my research team spent 2 years gathering all of this information. So we interviewed all those leaders, as I said. We sent all these surveys out. We get all of this data back, right? And as an academic, I live in the world of data. I love to look at data. But data is black and white. It either works for you, right, or you find nothing. And for us, we were really nervous about what we might find with this, because we weren't sure, would the ideas of compassion resonate with employees in an organization? And if it did, would it drive anything? Would it make any sense organizationally at all? So 2 years worth of work, and all I got to do is click a button and I get all the answers back, right? And so I'm sitting at my desk and I close my eyes and I click the button. It all runs, all my statistics run, and here's what we find. It was related to everything. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming, right? So let me break down what we're looking at here. So these are scatter plots, and essentially what it's saying is that all of the 6 behaviors that I showed you earlier, dignity, authenticity, presence, integrity, and so on, was connected to things like discretionary effort and creativity and intent to turn over and well-being and health and so on. In fact, here's some of that data actually broken out. So this is the first time I've ever shared this data. So this is what turnover looks like when leaders promote a positive EVP. All of this black dots that you see are people that are looking for another job. That's an individual person looking for another job. Look how light that circle is. It's pretty light. That's suggesting that to the degree that employees experience a positive EVP as demonstrated through their leader, right, on those 6 competencies, dignity, authenticity, presence, and so on, they are highly unlikely to leave the company. And for crying out loud, why would they? Why would you leave a place like that, right? If we move further, I mentioned also the ideas of dignity and accountability. this was a really surprising finding for us, that dignity was the most powerfully predictive leader behavior, right? It costs nothing to treat people with dignity. But I can tell you countless stories of things that I've witnessed as a customer, right? Watching a manager interact with their employee, yelling at the person because they didn't get my coffee right, or because they didn't get my food didn't come out correctly. And that person, you're walking away with their head down and their shoulders slumped. The other was accountability, and we were really excited about the idea of accountability because it made compassion not soft. The problem that we had presenting this back to the companies, and there were about 20 of them that participated with us, was that we couldn't present them a model that just had what they might categorize as these soft skills. Accountability was a hard line stance that leaders took, that they held their teams to high expectations, and they expected their team members to meet their goals every quarter or whatever. But when they didn't, they also didn't let those things slide. They would come beside them and say, hey, I noticed you didn't make your numbers this quarter, whatever. And they treated that person with dignity and with respect and authenticity, but they still held them accountable. Where that's important is it sends a message to the rest of your team, right? So if I'm not willing to hold you accountable, why should I be able to hold you accountable? So accountability was not just this interaction, but it was the way the leader was experienced and perceived by the entire team. We were really encouraged by that finding. Next is health. And this is increasingly where our research is going at the University of Louisville. We are looking at the intersection of work and health. We're trying to understand why so many people in the United States are sick. Why do so many people have heart disease? Why do so many people have hypertension? And is there a link between how people are experiencing their work and the demands that dual income families have, where a mom and a dad are both working? Is there a link between that experience and someone's health outcomes? So what you see on the screen here, all the black dots that you see are people who say that they feel like they're very healthy. Ladies and gentlemen, that circle's almost all black. When people experience a leader through the lens of dignity and authenticity and this positive employee value proposition, when they believe their voice matters and their contributions matter and their work is meaningful, they report that they're more healthy than people who don't get to experience that. That's astonishing to me. It's astonishing that someone's experience of work can impact distal health outcomes that will impact their long-term health. When we go into organizations and we look at their medical claims, all right, so now we're getting very granular. So we'll take a company's medical claims data, your actual expense, right? How many times do people go to the doctor? What are the tests that they're having run? What are the surgeries that they're having run? How many times have they been to the ER? We de-identify all of that data, okay? And then we pair that up with what's happening at their workplace. So value propositions, leader behaviors, engagement. We can explain a dominant primary factor that accounts for 44% of the residualized aggregated medical claims. Here's essentially what that means. I can predict how often and what kinds of exams a person may have based solely on how they answer some culture and climate questions about their company. So let that sink in for a minute. Medical claims should not cluster. They should not be predictable. How often you go to the doctor and how often you go to the doctor and how often you go to the doctor should be different from me. But if we all work in the same department, we cluster together. That's amazing. That's incredible. So what we're trying to do is shift this as this is a workplace epidemic, right? Of what we call stinky leaders, and these stinky leaders are actually impacting people's health. So if we can train the competencies of dignity, authenticity, presence, and so on, then we can potentially impact that. And if we can reduce that number by 5%, 10%, 15%, think about the savings in healthcare costs alone, right? So if we just talk ROI, big companies spend millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in healthcare claims year after year after year. If we can reduce that by 5%, just by upscaling some leadership competencies, that's not only an incredible savings for the company, but people will experience life very differently as a result of that. So I'm going to pause here, and I want to leave this up as the context for the conversation. So I ended the keynote today with these three things. So do we want to rethink this idea? Is it worth having a conversation about how we transform work experiences, how we become better leaders, how we can create organizations and create experiences for employees that not only attract them but retain them in ways that change their life? I mean, that's the kind of company that I want to work for. And that's also the kind of company that I'm interested in researching. And I think the three things that we're going to need to do are to think about this idea of ongoing transformation, active collaboration. And it's going to require us from time to time to both, as leaders, to both lead, to stand up, right, and say, no, that's not how we do things here. We treat people with dignity. We don't talk to people like that, right? And then it's also going to require us to follow. And it's going to require us to check our ego at the door from time to time. And that's difficult to do because we've spent our career in leadership positions. And to get behind something and follow can be a challenging thing for a leader to do. So let me pause here and let's have a discussion. What about this has resonated with you, or what questions do you have about some of the information that I've presented that I can clarify for you? What do you think? Are there any questions, any ideas? And I'm going to sit down. Yes, sir.
So EVP is something that is universal. Is EVP something that's universal? So like the 6 values that you said.
Yes.
Or would it need to be have to be customized to a particular employee group? And if that's the case, then how do you do it at scale with the organization?
Yeah,
because for the size of organizations that we work in, it's so I've been someone who's been working with EVP for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And I feel it's very difficult, and in theory it sounds very good.
Yeah.
But when in practice I try to get it done, it just ends up as being very wishy-washy for the business, and not really making sense, because for a certain employee group, let's say, I don't know, personal benefits or a good work culture makes sense, but for a different group like say sales guys, compensation is big, right? Yes. How do you customize your approach to various employee groups, or should we just go with the 6 qualities and try to do it all across?
That's a really good question, and I'd like to hear more about your experience with that. Let me respond. Let me react to that, and then and let's continue the dialogue amongst all of us here. So the first part of your question is, should you have a general approach to EVP, or should you customize it? I think you have to customize it. I think an EVP is about the individual, right? And it is about the individual's experience at work. And I think you're right that depending on where that person might be, or depending on the kind of talent that you've recruited and retained in the company, a person's EVP may change, right? From person to person. I think it can be down to that kind of granular level. What I think has been, where I've seen this work as a compelling practice in an organization, in a large organization, is when a company will go in and identify the organizational narrative. What's the story of this company? Who is this company? What do they stand for? What's the vision, mission, and values? Not what we say, right, but what we actually do. And then how do we link what we're doing with something that's meaningful, and capturing that information in a way that is compelling to employees. I think you're getting into the idea of motivation, where what motivates employees. My personal opinion on that is that an organization, no matter how big or small, needs a combination of external rewards. And I'm not talking about pay. We can talk about pay as a separate issue in a moment. But pay, in my view, is not a motivator, it's a satisfier. External rewards that are tangible, right? So they're, maybe we earn trips, or we earn cool merchandise or something. There's something that I work towards with the right combination, bless you, of internal motivators, right? Now there's the difference between intrinsic and internal, okay? So intrinsic is this idea of I do this work because it's satisfying. I just like accounting and that's why I'm doing this work, right? But internal is when someone says, you know what, I can get behind that story. I can get behind that mission and that vision and that value. That's something I believe in, and because of that, I can get behind that. And when you couple that with an individualized external rewards system, I think you're in the sweet spot there. I think you're in a total sweet spot. So I think to answer your question, I think we really do need to look at employee motivation a little bit, because the value proposition doesn't motivate. The value proposition is the brand, is the why, right? And it's my job as the leader of the organization to have a compelling EVP, to know what it is and to be able to articulate that. And then the employee has the ability to make a decision, right? Either I like that or I don't like that. And when the status quo changes with the value proposition, then my behavior may change. I think value propositions are commonplace, right? They're the reason that we're here in this room today. They're the reason that you wear the kinds of clothes that you wear, the reason that you eat the kind of food that you eat. There's a value proposition around everything. And as soon as that changes, as soon as the status quo changes for that value prop, then I change my behavior accordingly. So me saying that, what's your reaction to that?
My reaction to that would be, yeah, sure, all of us have value propositions in all our organizations, but it's on a website. And,
that's the problem.
And rarely does it reflect in the values of business, and sometimes, I think that's where the gap lies.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with you that employee motivation and employee value proposition has a fine line between it, but in terms of practice and in terms of really living the values that I'm speaking on is speaking for, and I think that's where the gap lies, and that's where I'm a little lost. Personally,
no, I get it. I think I think the core of what you said was it's on a website, and that's not a value proposition. Though that's just words, right? And they're meaningless. They're totally meaningless. And when that is positioned as the value prop, that's not a value prop.
What would be the difference between values and value proposition?
I think they're connected. I think the values of an organization drive an employee's value proposition, because it is the behavior that we see. So my values influence, even just as a person, what I say I value, you should see that in behavior, right? So I think that an organization's values, if I say, for example, one of our values is sustainability, then that should be embedded someplace in the value prop, not as words, but as absolute action.
So value propositions would mean manifestation of values, practices that manifest values?
I think that is a good operationalization of, yes. I think that works very well, yeah.
And I also see the need for us to reiterate those in forms of
constantly
open communication and stuff, constantly.
Yeah, because what's the organizational narrative? What's the story, right? And if we're not storytellers, someone else is telling the story, right? They're telling it on Glassdoor, they're telling it on LinkedIn, or they're telling it some other place. So we have to own that story. We have to own that value prop. And we have to be constantly reiterating it. And that's our job as leaders, right? That's our job being at the table, is to constantly reinforce that organizational narrative. Yes.
I have a follow-up question on the leader behaviors.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the sessions that I was attending just before this, which was about leadership, leader behaviors, some aspects such as humility, for example, empathy, very difficult to teach when we engage in management development centers, right? Or we're talking to leaders of being, managers, say for about 5, 7, 10 years, 15 years. And you're trying to teach them some basics which are uncompromisable. But you see there is a void. Now, my point is, where do we begin, and how much can we expect to do as HR professionals in terms of how much can we move the needle? In addition to reiterating values, talking about not leaving it on the website, but really talking about it in action, showing all of that. But how do we move the needle with the leaders from a training, from a learning, coaching, engagement perspective? What's been your research? What is your research saying?
So I'd like to answer that from two different perspectives. One is, before I worked at the University of Louisville, I worked for a large multinational company in Miami, Florida. And I was in charge of the management organization development team. And I was 24 years old, 25 years old. I was young enough to not have a clue what I was doing, right? And I had no business doing any kind of executive coaching. But part of my job was to do executive coaching. And I got partnered with the captain of the fleet for the company. So this was a shipping company, who was in charge of environmental waste and wastewater and solid waste and things like that. And it was well known throughout the company that everyone hated being on his team. He got the lowest engagement scores company-wide. It was his team was a disaster, right? They avoided him. He never opened his door. He was everything that I just mentioned about he took people's ideas, he lied all the time, he broke promises. And I got a call from our CEO that said, I need you to do some executive coaching with Captain. Can you go do that? And I was like, no, I can't, because this guy's unbreakable, right? Like, this guy he's a stone statue. And I went into his office and I sat down and we had this conversation. And he's sitting behind this really big desk. He's got a bunch of important stuff on his desk, and he's blah, 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 blah. He's pointing his finger at me and telling me how great his team is and stuff like that. And I said, Captain, nobody likes working here for you. And it was like I punched him in the stomach. And he said, what are you talking about? And my team loves me. And I was like, actually, Captain, they don't like you at all. They all want to quit and leave. And he paused for a minute. And I'm summarizing the conversation that went on for about 30 minutes, right? So we had this conversation developmentally about what is going on with your team. Why is everybody's doors closed all the time? Why do you have the lowest engagement scores in the entire company for years and years and years? And you're fine with it, right? And this guy starts to cry in the office. Imagine it. I'm 25. I don't have a clue what I'm doing, and I got this guy crying behind the desk, right? I don't know how to help this guy. And he said, it's the first time anybody has ever said that to me. How do I change? How do I get better? I tell you that story because I believe that every leader has the potential to be absolutely amazing. I think that's true. Because to believe the opposite would be that there are some people that are not savable, right? And I've worked with some people that I don't care for, that actually inspired the Stinky Leadership Study, right? That if they called me today, I'd hang the phone with them. But I think there's hope for that person because I'm unwilling to accept that for some people there's just no hope, right? So I think we do two things. I think we have to be honest. As human resource professionals, I think we have to have really difficult, hard conversations. And we lead those conversations with data. We use data to help us drive those decision making. But we do it in the same way that we would want those leaders to act. So we deliver that message with dignity. And we deliver that message with empathy and support. And we listen to what that person has to say. Oftentimes I find that we're not willing to have the conversation with the person. So if we want to see that change in that person, in that particular leader, we have to be willing to step up to the plate and have the conversation. And I'm telling you right now, it's going to be hard. It'll be difficult, right? It's going to take a tremendous amount of courage. And you may need to go home after you have that conversation because it's going to be, who knows what the outcome of that conversation could be. But I would encourage you to have it because the people underneath that are suffering greatly. There are other things. I believe the competencies that we talked about are trainable. There's an idea in adult learning theory that we use a lot at the University of Louisville, Jack Mesereau's transformational learning theory. And Mesereau talks about the disorienting dilemma. All right? The disorienting dilemma as being the only reason an adult changes or learns anything. Because there's no other reason to change. It's status quo. Life is grand, right? So why would I need a new skill? You telling me I need to be more compassionate. Well, that sounds dumb. I'm doing just fine, right? I don't need to be nice to people. That sounds really soft. It is only when someone encounters a disorienting dilemma that they're unable to make sense of. So like the conversation that I had with Captain. And I said, Captain, people don't like you. And he was like, what? People don't like me. People love me. No, they don't. They can't stand you. They're transferring out of your team constantly. Your turnover is like 120%. Can you help me understand that? That for him at that moment was his disorienting dilemma. Now, did he get better? He did. It took a long time. It took a lot of developmental work. He had a big ego. He was a captain. He had 4 stripes on his shoulder. He could walk in any ship and do whatever he wanted to do. And he had some guy from HR who was 25 years old telling him nobody liked him. So it took a little while. Because we had to do what? We had to build trust. And he had no reason to trust me. So I think we have to have hard conversations. I think these things are trainable. I would ask us to think about that in the context of a disorienting dilemma. Now, I'm not suggesting that we create disorienting dilemmas for people, right? Like, put them through crucibles. I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think it helps explain why some leaders change and why some leaders don't. That's a really good question. Yes, ma'am.
My question is related to the context of the organizations. We have value systems and we have employee value propositions as well. But if the environment in the organization or the operating structure of the organization is informal, it has remained informal forever, and that's what is treasured. The culture which is upheld in the organization is that of remaining informal. Is there a place of putting these things, and what could be a business case of putting these things? Because typically when you discuss, often you realize that people feel that we have a very sound and common understanding, and this is more like doing slogans. Why do we need them?
Yeah. So let me make sure that I understand the question. The question is around a company's culture is informal. Why do we need these kinds of things like value props and values and things like that? To be honest with you, I think there's a better reason to have them in an informal place. Sometimes there's a great case to be made around being informal. I'll give you a case study example. So are you familiar with the company Zappos? Zappos was a large shoe distributor in the United States for a very long time, and they were crazy. They had wild parties on Fridays. They ate free food. They had cereal everywhere. They threw stuff at it. I mean, you came to work in whatever you wanted. You want to come in your pajamas? Have a big time. Nobody cared. It was super informal, right? They never codified those values. They never codified the idea of this is an informal structure here. We're a flat organization. They never spent time doing that. And then they were bought by Amazon. Have you ever been to it? You know Amazon? Amazon is super formal, right? They have a lot of policies. They're a big company. They need those policies and procedures. The culture at Zappos died. So they were acquired by Amazon. They didn't have those things codified. And as a result of them, they lost their organizational identity. Zappos today is a tenth of what it was 5 years ago as a result of that. So I think we have to have the value proposition, but we do it in the informal way. So we don't have to come at it from a formal perspective. We can come at that from wild ideas. We can have maybe whiteboards on the back of the cafeteria. People write, what are the values that are important to you when you work here, right? What are the things that inspire? What are the things that move you? What do you think the vision of the company is? And then distill all of that down and then present that back to them in a really kind of wild and wacky way. But I think you have to embrace the informalness of a culture to informally have an EVP that codifies what it means to work here. And I think if that can happen, the kind of talent you can attract from that would be tremendous. I think it's a really competitive advantage. Does that make sense? I was sad to see Zappos go by the wayside. That was sad. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So I saw that you had two models which you projected.
Yes.
One question was, so what kind of statistical models you use specifically to come up with those? And the second is, which I have seen based on my experience, is that when you want to do such kind of analysis, it is always very difficult to get the data.
Yes.
And what kind of data specifically? So how do you handle that situation?
Yeah. So this is, thank you for asking me a statistics question. You and me may be friends after this, buddy. So we use structural equation modeling to come up with the models. And there's sample size limitations to that, so you have to have lots and lots of people depending on the types of variables that you have, that you're working with. But we typically use structural equation models to do that. The data that you saw, this here is created using a program called Tableau. And I like Tableau because it's a drag and drop. It's highly interactive and visual. But we use structural equation modeling for all the, well, not for all of them. Sometimes we use our linear modeling, other things like that. But SEM is primarily what we use. In this model, the compassionate leadership model, if I can for a minute, just speak to this. We use what's called the bifactor model. So what that means, there's a unifying model of compassion, right? That's a latent function. It's a latent structure, which means we can't observe it. So it's like the wind. The latent function is like the wind. And then each of the 6 behaviors that we identify were a nested model within that primary model, so secondary model. And they all worked great. It was amazing. We were really happy. The data was really clean, and it was good. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for enlightening us. My question is, you've talked about EVP. One of the facets that you've talked about is leadership. What are the other facets of creating an employee value proposition? What are the different tenets of EVP? I have 3 different questions.
Yeah. Oh, 3. All right. We'll get to all of them.
Okay.
All right. So the first, to answer your question, what are the other facets? So leadership, I think, is really important. I think the coworkers that you work with are really important. I think the people that we spend our day-to-day with, the people that are our friends at work from time to time, can be really important for us. I also think let's think about this in terms of moments, all right? So I would think of an EVP in terms of, what's your first day like? I was talking to somebody about this in the hallway. What's an employee's first day like, and what kind of intentional planning goes into the onboarding? And then what's their first week like? And then what's their first month like? And then 6 months and 12 months. What's their first year? What's their year anniversary? What's that look like for an employee? And so I think everything that's captured in that first day and that second day and so on down the line, whatever we decide those milestones are, I think that is what makes an EVP come alive. It has to be something that is breathing and living. Otherwise, it's words. And no one is motivated by that, right? I used to work for a company. I carried a badge around, and it had the mission on the back of it. I don't have a clue what the mission of the company was, even when I worked there, and I still don't today, because no one cared. It was never enacted. There was never behavior that was put behind that vision statement. So that's question 1. How about number 2?
Yeah. Very often we hear in our organizations that people say culture has changed, especially people who've been there for a very long time. How do you qualify culture? How do you state it? Does it change? Is it common across organization? I know I'm asking some stupid questions.
No, you're not. Yes, great.
But how do you define culture? Because if you want people to carry it, whether they're new, whether they're growing, whether they're transforming, what is the linchpin? What is my anchor? So how do I define culture?
So would it be okay? I'm not deflecting your question, but I'd like to pose that to the room. Does culture change, and how do you codify it? So what do you think?
So it evolves with time, and I think culture of any place would evolve with time, and it's actually an agglomeration of the experiences you have as an individual in that place, and it's agglomeration of experiences that you have interacting with other people. And in terms of, let's say, as an individual, I would define it as how I experience the organization and my interactions with others. That's the culture for me. That may be in terms of formal processes, practices, and policies. That may be in terms of the informal behavior the leader has towards me and towards others, which is what your research talks about all. And I think it evolves with time. With leaders changing, with your colleagues changing, it evolves.
Okay. Awesome. What are others? What
And
other
with context changing as well, sometimes I may not change with the context.
Okay.
So that's when I start saying that the culture has changed, and I may not be in tune with the context. So there needs to be a lot more communication so that I move along with how my organization wants me to move forward.
I love it. Yeah.
I think culture is an esoteric word. What I can see, feel is demonstrated behavior. So if I want to change culture, it would be to recognize what I want to see repeated.
Okay.
That would be the one thing that
I think sometimes culture is
Go ahead.
imposed and changed.
It's imposed and changed.
Because of the need of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And many a times cultures are also influenced by the leaders. Leaders' behavior, new leaders coming in.
Yeah.
So culture may not be a static thing, and it is changing, but the only thing is that conscience keeper of the company should really look at the basic ethos of the organization and company is kind of maintained. And some of these toxic behaviors or toxic traits you're talking about. I think one comment, it was very eye-opener in terms of you're correlating EVP to the well-being. Because we have grown up living in a situation where we think that by and large the organizations are stressors. The jobs are stressors, and it is only on the stress coping capability of people are creating the differentiation on people. I think that looks a myth, and I think it's a great eye-opening for us. But one thing I would like to understand is when we talk about AVP, we are talking about employers' value proposition. And when we are just looking at the lens of leadership, how do we integrate as an organization level to say that this is an employer's value proposition?
So let me ask, where do you think that starts? And we have a third question and another comment that I want to get to, but let's tackle this for just a second. Where does the employee value proposition start with leaders? I think that's the question. How do leaders integrate to communicate that? Any ideas?
No, mine was a comment on the culture. So if you're taking that conversation forward, you're good.
And then I want to come back to that, to your thoughts. Ma'am, do you have a thought?
Yeah, it starts with how the leader has interacted with the employee. And I think, the question you asked, how we teach leadership is also very boxed. Yeah. And, we talk about certain behaviors that team members would kind of appreciate, which is incorrect because each individual is different in your team and you need to adapt to the different styles of the team. I think that is primarily the leader's responsibility. And, if the leader is able to do that, he is creating or she is creating the right culture in that particular context. And this pretty much answers the question that he has as well, that the leaders should be taught how to customize their responses to their own team members because each person comes with different backgrounds, with different experiences, and the same style will not work with all of them.
One of the things that we might say, and I keep going back to the question, the very first question that you asked is, how do we get inside the heads of our employees in a way that we understand them and we know them as individuals? And how do we, because that's when we can then customize. And I think when people hear the word customize, you hear really hard work. I got to customize everything for everybody. I don't want to do that. It's too hard, right? But when you take the time to sit down and have tea with an employee, you say, let's talk about what your future looks like here. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Well, how can I help you? What can I do? That's a game-changing conversation. And I would ask the folks in this room, when's the last time you had a conversation like that? Not with an employee, but for you. When's the last time somebody came to you and said, where do you see yourself in 5 years? How can we help you? What are the skills that you need? What are the competencies that you need to develop? I think we thirst for that conversation. Absolutely thirst for it. And any chance we get to have that conversation, I think we jump at that. I do want to go back. Ma'am, you had a comment about culture, and I just want to make sure that we get a chance to hear your voice.
Awesome. So I guess we were talking about how do cultures evolve, and to my mind, I wanted to reiterate that cultures do evolve. They evolve with leaders and their style of adapting to an organization, but more importantly, what happens is there's a common language that floats in the organization.
Yeah.
And with time, there are some terminologies that define your culture. And over a period of time, if that common language continues to be there is a culture.
Yes.
Or else that common language changes and the culture has actually changed.
And what is that common language? It's the basis of an EVP.
It's the basis of EVP.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to codify it, right? So that when it does change, and I think we're going to see ebbs and flows, right? Like we're going to see these things change, and that's natural. But if we know the language and we have a narrative, this is what it means to be here. This is what this company is about. These are the values that we stand for. This is how we treat our employees, right? And we make a stand for that, then when it changes, no, we're still okay because we've probably attracted a leader where those values are pretty ingrained and pretty embedded.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good stuff. Ma'am, you had a question? And I think we may be running short on time. 5 minutes. All right, we'll take last question. No pressure, ma'am, but last question. So you want it to be amazing.
I was just saying, I don't know if I'm audible. I was just saying that I think culture changes over time. As long as you have your values set, culture can't really change so drastically that people actually experience a different work environment. So as long as your values are clearly articulated, and it is important for leaders to first exhibit that they stay by values or they exhibit those values, because that's who everyone is actually looking up to. And one of the questions is why is it not top down and why is it not bottom up and why is it top down? I think because it's a pyramid at the end of it, so there's few on top who really need to lead it so that others can follow. So that's actually how I see that.
That's a great final comment. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I want to wrap up here, and then I want to turn over to my colleague, Betsy Schneider. Let's not miss this opportunity. Let's not miss this opportunity to continue this conversation. If you haven't had a chance to, if you don't know everybody at your table, you exchange cards and connect on Twitter. And you're welcome to connect with me on Twitter. I'll put my stuff back up here so that we can stay connected. Don't miss the opportunity here to get the idea that you need to when you go home to start that change. Whatever that might be, right? I don't know what the context of your organization is, but I do know that we have the potential and the possibility to make radical change around the way work gets experienced. And I'm deeply, deeply, deeply passionate about it. If I can help at all, if there's something that I can do for you personally, I hope you'll reach out to me and let me know what that is. I'd be honored and absolutely humbled to do anything I can for you. So with that, let me turn it over, to my friend, who is going to introduce Ms. Schneider.
Thank you, Brad. Now I'll request. Thank you. Now I'll request Betsy Schneider, Vice President Marketing BI Worldwide, to give a vote of thanks. And we post this so we can always have more interactions over the tea and coffee which is being served. Betsy, over to you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting discussion, and I think the key is that leaders really play a critical role in driving forward in an organization. I mean, they're the pivot point. But the other point that you brought up so eloquently in a lot of your comments is that it's the leader's job to get inside the employee's head. So you may have a team of 10, and they all are a little bit different. And so it's the job of the leader to take that EVP, drive it forward with the understanding of how that works with the employee. So if you think about that, it's that whole context of EVP as the big strategy, the culture, the norms, etc., taking that forward and then making that a great place to work for employees. So with that, I would like to thank SHRM for this session. I'd like to thank Dr. Brad Shuck. Let's hear it for him one more time. And we do have time for further discussion. That was a very rich discussion over some tea right now. So again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.